Between the rocky coastlines of Iran and Oman, a narrow passage of water barely 21 miles wide carries the lifeblood of the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the wider Arabian Sea, handles roughly 21 million barrels of oil every day. That figure represents nearly one-fifth of global petroleum consumption. When this waterway becomes contested, the consequences ripple through every energy market on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz forms a natural bottleneck at the southeastern edge of the Persian Gulf. On the northern shore lies Iran, whose territory includes several strategic islands within the strait itself. On the southern side, the Muzandam Peninsula, an exclave of Oman, juts northward into the passage. Just south of Oman's coast, the United Arab Emirates controls territory along the Gulf of Oman. This configuration creates a geographic choke point with profound strategic implications. The Persian Gulf contains some of the world's largest oil reserves. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Iran all rely on the strait as their primary, and in many cases only, export route for crude oil. Tankers load at terminals throughout the Gulf, then navigate southward through Hormuz toward Asian, European, and other global markets. There is no viable alternative pipeline capacity that could replace this maritime route. The geography itself creates the dependency. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil and refined petroleum products pass through the Strait of Hormuz daily in recent reporting periods. That volume represents roughly 21% of global petroleum liquids consumption. Additionally, significant volumes of liquefied natural gas transit the strait, making it a critical artery for both oil and LNG markets. The numbers underscore the strait's role in global energy supply chains. Tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz follows a traffic separation scheme established under international maritime conventions. Inbound and outbound lanes are separated by a buffer zone, each lane approximately 2 miles wide. Vessels heading into the Persian Gulf use the lane closer to Oman, those exiting toward the Gulf of Oman use the lane closer to Iran. This separation reduces collision risk but also creates predictable paths that are easily monitored or targeted. The strait's narrowest navigable section measures just 21 miles between the Omani and Iranian coasts. Within that span, the actual shipping lanes occupy less than half the width. Rocky islands, shallow waters, and designated exclusion zones further constrain the usable passage. Very large crude carriers, supertankers that can carry 2 million barrels, have limited room for maneuvering. The physical geography transforms this waterway into a true choke point, where even a single obstruction can disrupt the entire flow. Iran controls the entire northern coastline of the strait and maintains naval bases, missile installations, and radar facilities along the shore. Iranian military assets include fast attack craft, naval mines, anti-ship missiles, and coastal artillery. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy operates from bases near Bandar Abbas and on islands within the strait itself. This positioning gives Iran the capability to threaten or disrupt tanker traffic, a fact that has shaped regional security calculations for decades. Oman's Muzandam Peninsula forms the southern boundary of the strait. Unlike its neighbors, Oman has historically maintained a policy of neutrality and diplomatic engagement with both Western powers and Iran. The port of Qasab, located on the Muzandam coast, serves as a monitoring point and has been used by international naval forces for coordination. Oman's geographic position makes it a critical partner in any effort to maintain freedom of navigation through the strait. The United Arab Emirates operates major oil export terminals at Jebel Ali, Fujairah, and other facilities. Fujairah, located on the Gulf of Oman just outside the strait, has become a critical bunkering hub where tankers refuel and take on supplies. The UAE has invested heavily in pipeline infrastructure designed to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, reflecting concerns about the waterway's vulnerability. Still, the majority of UAE oil exports continue to transit the strait. On an average day, dozens of crude oil tankers, product carriers, and LNG vessels pass through the strait in both directions. Tanker operators file navigation plans, communicate with maritime traffic control, and monitor weather and security conditions. Vessel tracking systems allow shippers, insurers, and governments to follow each tanker's progress in real time. The system functions smoothly under normal conditions, but it is designed for commerce, not conflict. Any disruption to this routine has immediate consequences. A military disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could take multiple forms. Naval mines could be laid across shipping lanes, forcing tankers to halt or divert. Anti-ship missiles could target vessels, creating a no-go zone. Iranian fast attack craft could swarm and board tankers. A sunken vessel could physically block the channel. Even credible threats, without actual attacks, can be enough to deter tanker captains and spike insurance premiums, effectively closing the strait to commercial traffic. The strait has been contested before. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, both sides attacked tankers in what became known as the Tanker War. More than 500 ships were struck by missiles, mines, or naval fire over 8 years. International navies eventually intervened to escort red-flagged tankers. More recently, in 2019, several tankers were attacked or seized near the strait amid escalating tensions between Iran and Western powers. Each incident demonstrated the waterway's vulnerability. When credible threats emerge around the Strait of Hormuz, global oil prices react immediately. Traders factor in a risk premium, the additional cost reflecting potential supply disruption. Even temporary closures or the perception of danger can push crude prices up by tens of dollars per barrel within hours. Energy analysts monitor the strait constantly, knowing that a sustained disruption would force consuming nations to draw on strategic reserves and scramble for alternative supplies, with ripple effects across every sector dependent on affordable energy. Maritime insurance premiums for tankers transiting the strait are sensitive to security conditions. Underwriters assess war risk, and when tensions rise, premiums can multiply. Tanker freight rates, the cost to charter a vessel, also surge when demand for alternative routes increases or when owners demand hazard pay for crews. During the 2019 incidents, some analysts reported insurance costs increasing tenfold. These financial signals ripple through supply chains, raising costs for refiners and ultimately consumers. There are limited alternatives to the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia operates the East-West pipeline, which can carry crude oil from the Persian Gulf to Red Sea terminals, bypassing the strait. The UAE has the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, which delivers to Fujairah. But combined, these pipelines can handle only a fraction of the strait's daily throughput. No other infrastructure exists that could replace 21 million barrels per day. Any closure would leave most Gulf oil stranded. Asian economies are disproportionately reliant on oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz. China, Japan, South Korea, and India import significant volumes of Persian Gulf crude. For these nations, a sustained closure would force rationing, price spikes, and economic slowdown. China has invested in overland pipelines from Russia and Central Asia partly to reduce its exposure to Hormuz-related risk. But maritime routes remain dominant, and the strait's security is a top strategic concern for Asian governments and energy companies. European nations also import oil and LNG that passes through the strait, though to a lesser degree than Asia. Still, the interconnectedness of global energy markets means a Hormuz disruption would affect Europe through price contagion. Liquefied natural gas from Qatar, much of which transits the strait, supplies European gas markets. Any interruption would tighten supply and drive up prices across the continent, compounding energy security challenges already heightened by geopolitical tensions elsewhere. The strait is not only an oil choke point, it is also critical for liquefied natural gas exports. Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, ships almost all its production through Hormuz. LNG carriers, massive vessels specially designed to transport gas chilled to -160°C, follow the same lanes as oil tankers. Any military closure would halt these shipments, disrupting gas supplies to Asia and Europe and spiking prices in global LNG markets. Multiple navies maintain a presence in and around the Strait of Hormuz. The United States Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, conducts regular patrols and escort operations. The United Kingdom, France, and other nations periodically deploy warships to the region. These forces aim to deter aggression and reassure commercial shippers. However, the proximity of Iranian forces and the confined geography mean that any naval engagement would carry high risk of escalation and collateral damage to civilian vessels. Tanker operators have developed security protocols for high-risk transits. Vessels may travel in convoys, increase speed through the strait, implement anti-boarding measures, and embark private security teams. Shipping companies share threat intelligence and coordinate with naval authorities. Automatic identification systems broadcast each vessel's position, though some operators disable these systems in contested waters to avoid targeting. These measures reduce but cannot eliminate risk. The strait remains inherently vulnerable. Naval mines represent one of the most serious threats in the strait. Mines are inexpensive, easy to deploy covertly, and difficult to clear. A single mine can sink or disable a supertanker carrying millions of barrels of oil. Mine clearing operations require specialized vessels and can take weeks or months. Even the suspicion of mines can close shipping lanes. During the tanker war, mines damaged dozens of vessels and prompted large-scale international minesweeping efforts. The threat persists today. Iran possesses a substantial inventory of anti-ship missiles, including cruise missiles and ballistic missiles capable of reaching targets throughout the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. These weapons can be launched from coastal sites, naval vessels, or aircraft. Their range and speed make them difficult to defend against, especially in the confined waters of the strait. Western intelligence agencies monitor Iranian missile deployments closely, as even a single successful strike could deter further commercial traffic and escalate the crisis. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy operates scores of fast attack craft, small, highly maneuverable boats armed with machine guns, rockets, and anti-ship missiles. These vessels employ swarm tactics, surrounding larger ships and overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers. In confined waters like the Strait of Hormuz, these tactics are particularly effective. Large tankers cannot maneuver quickly, making them vulnerable to boarding or direct attack. Defending against swarms requires coordination, surveillance, and rapid response capabilities. Iran has demonstrated the capability to board and seize tankers in the strait. In 2019, Iranian forces detained the British-flagged tanker Stena Impero, holding it for weeks. Such actions can be framed as enforcement of maritime law or retaliation for perceived violations. Boarding operations create legal and diplomatic complications, as vessels may be flagged in one country, owned by entities in another, and crewed by nationals of a third. Each seizure tests international response mechanisms and raises the stakes for commercial shipping. A sunk or disabled vessel in the shipping lanes could physically block the strait. A large tanker run aground or scuttled in the narrow passage would halt traffic until salvage crews could clear the obstruction. Such operations are complex, time-consuming, and dangerous in a contested environment. Military planners consider this scenario a high-impact but plausible risk. The precedent of the Ever Given container ship blocking the Suez Canal in 2021 illustrated how a single vessel can paralyze a choke point, though Hormuz's geopolitical context makes any blockage far more consequential. International law enshrines the principle of freedom of navigation, and multiple nations have stated commitments to keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. In practice, a response to closure would likely involve multinational naval operations, mine clearance, convoy escorts, and diplomatic efforts to de-escalate. The United Nations Security Council could be invoked, though vetoes complicate collective action. Past interventions provide templates, but the scale and speed of a modern response would depend on the nature of the disruption and the geopolitical climate at the time. A prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz would trigger cascading economic effects. Refineries dependent on Gulf crude would reduce output, causing shortages of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Petrochemical plants would curtail production, affecting plastics, fertilizers, and pharmaceuticals. Freight costs for all goods would rise as fuel prices climbed. Stock markets would react to the uncertainty. Central banks might face inflationary pressure. The global economy, still integrated around affordable oil, remains vulnerable to disruptions at this single geographic point. Major oil-consuming nations maintain strategic petroleum reserves, stockpiles of crude oil and refined products held for emergencies. The United States, China, Japan, and European countries could release reserves to offset a Hormuz disruption. However, reserves are finite and typically designed to bridge short-term supply gaps. A closure lasting months would exhaust these buffers, forcing more drastic measures such as rationing, economic controls, or military escalation. Reserves buy time, they do not solve the underlying vulnerability. Demand for oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz is inelastic in the short term. Asian economies cannot quickly shift to alternative energy sources or suppliers. Aircraft, ships, and vehicles cannot run without fuel. Industries dependent on petrochemicals cannot pivot overnight. This inelasticity means that even small reductions in supply can cause disproportionate price increases. In economic terms, the strait is a single point of failure in a system with limited redundancy and enormous consequences for failure. Modern threats extend beyond the physical. Cyberattacks on tanker navigation systems, port infrastructure, or pipeline controls could disrupt operations without a single shot fired. GPS spoofing could mislead vessels into dangerous waters. Disinformation campaigns could amplify panic and uncertainty. These hybrid tactics allow adversaries to create disruption while maintaining deniability. Maritime security now encompasses not just naval power but also cybersecurity, information warfare, and the resilience of digital systems that underpin shipping operations. Maritime insurance underwriters base their premiums on risk assessments that include geopolitical analysis, historical incident data, and current threat intelligence. When tensions rise around the Strait of Hormuz, underwriters convene to reassess risk. Some may decline to cover transits altogether, forcing shippers to self-insure or seek coverage in secondary markets at prohibitive cost. The insurance industry effectively acts as a barometer of perceived risk, and its decisions can accelerate or dampen the flow of tanker traffic through contested waters. Tanker crews, often multinational, from the Philippines, India, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere, face direct personal risk in a Hormuz crisis. Unions and industry groups advocate for crew welfare, and captains have the authority to refuse transits deemed too dangerous. If seafarers begin declining assignments or demanding hazard pay that makes voyages uneconomical, the strait could close not through military action but through a de facto labor stoppage. Human factors, often overlooked in strategic analysis, can determine whether tankers sail at all. The Strait of Hormuz is governed by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which guarantees the right of transit passage through international straits. Iran, Oman, and the UAE are all signatories. However, interpretations differ, and Iran has at times asserted control over the strait as a defensive measure. Any attempt to close the strait would be challenged as a violation of international law, but enforcement of that law in the face of military force is complex and dependent on the willingness of other states to intervene. A military conflict in the Strait of Hormuz would carry severe environmental risks. A struck tanker could spill millions of barrels of crude oil into the Persian Gulf, a relatively enclosed body of water with fragile marine ecosystems. The 1991 Gulf War saw deliberate oil spills used as a weapon, causing long-term ecological damage. Desalination plants along the Gulf Coast, which supply fresh water to millions, would be threatened by contamination. The environmental dimension of a Hormuz crisis extends beyond immediate casualties and economic loss. Not all disruptions involve total closure. Partial disruptions, intermittent attacks, harassment of selected vessels, or temporary mining could reduce traffic without halting it entirely. Such tactics allow an adversary to exert pressure while avoiding full-scale war. They also complicate response planning, as the threshold for international intervention becomes ambiguous. A slow-motion crisis, with tankers trickling through under threat, might be harder to address diplomatically and militarily than an outright blockade. The range of scenarios complicates preparedness. Recurring crises in the Strait of Hormuz have prompted long-term strategic shifts. Some nations are diversifying energy supplies, investing in renewables, or building pipeline infrastructure to reduce dependence on Gulf oil. Others are strengthening naval capabilities or forming regional security partnerships. Over time, these shifts could reduce the strait's centrality, but that transition will take decades. For now, and for the foreseeable future, the Strait of Hormuz remains indispensable, and its security remains a top priority for governments and industries worldwide. Ultimately, the best outcome for the Strait of Hormuz is diplomatic agreements that reduce tensions, build transparency, and create mechanisms for conflict resolution. Oman has historically played a mediating role between Iran and Western powers. International organizations, regional forums, and bilateral diplomacy all contribute to stability. The strait's importance creates incentives for restraint. No party benefits from a prolonged closure. But those incentives compete with domestic pressures, ideological commitments, and strategic rivalries that can override economic logic. Governments, shipping companies, and intelligence agencies monitor the Strait of Hormuz continuously. Satellite imagery tracks vessel movements and detects naval deployments. Signals intelligence listens for communications indicating hostile intent. Commercial maritime tracking services provide real-time data on tanker positions. This surveillance creates situational awareness but also raises the stakes. Each side knows the other is watching. Transparency can deter reckless action, but it can also accelerate crises if misinterpreted or manipulated. Oil companies, shipping firms, and tanker operators maintain contingency plans for Hormuz disruptions. These plans include alternative routing, reserve drawdowns, and coordination with governments. Industry groups conduct tabletop exercises simulating crisis scenarios. However, the scale and complexity of a real closure would test even the best prepared organizations. The global oil market operates on thin margins and just-in-time logistics. There is little buffer for prolonged disruption. Preparedness reduces chaos but cannot eliminate vulnerability. Media coverage of Strait of Hormuz incidents shapes public perception and political pressure. Headlines warning of closure can themselves move markets and influence policy. Sensationalism can amplify panic, underreporting can leave publics unprepared. Responsible journalism requires balancing the real risks against the need to avoid unnecessary alarm. The challenge is compounded by misinformation and state-sponsored narratives. How the crisis is communicated by governments, media, and industry affects the trajectory of events as much as the events themselves. Emerging technologies may alter the calculus around the Strait of Hormuz. Autonomous vessels could reduce crew risk. Advanced missile defense systems could protect tankers. Improved satellite reconnaissance could provide earlier warning. Conversely, new weapons, hypersonic missiles, underwater drones, AI-driven cyber tools, could make the strait even more vulnerable. The arms race between offense and defense continues, and the strait serves as a proving ground for technologies that will shape future maritime conflict. Technology alone will not resolve the underlying geopolitical tensions. The Strait of Hormuz has been contested for centuries. Ancient empires fought for control of the Persian Gulf, colonial powers secured routes to India and beyond, modern states vie for energy dominance. The geography has not changed, the same narrow passage that challenged ancient mariners constrains supertankers today. What has changed is the scale of consequence. A disruption that once mattered to a region now reverberates globally. The strait's history reminds us that choke points endure, and the competition for control over them is timeless. The question is not whether the Strait of Hormuz will face another crisis, but when. Tensions between Iran and Western powers ebb and flow. Regional rivalries persist. Energy demand continues to grow. Each incident, an attack, a seizure, a diplomatic breakdown, has the potential to escalate. The systems designed to prevent or manage such crises are tested repeatedly, and each test reveals vulnerabilities. The strait's strategic importance ensures it will remain a flashpoint, and global energy security will continue to hinge on this narrow passage of water. The Strait of Hormuz is more than a geographic feature, it is a fulcrum of the global economy. 21 million barrels of oil per day, critical LNG exports, and the energy security of nations all depend on the safe passage of vessels through this 21-mile-wide waterway. The strait's vulnerability is well understood, yet the world has no ready alternative. As long as oil remains central to global energy, and as long as the Persian Gulf holds vast reserves, the Strait of Hormuz will command attention, investment, and, when necessary, military. Its security is inseparable from global stability, and its future is one of the defining strategic questions of our time.